Welcome to How to Contribute to Azure Data Studio. I'm Skwiers Koballa. I'm a program manager at Microsoft.
Hi, I'm Hannah Chin, and I'm also a program manager at Microsoft.
When we talk about how to contribute to Azure Data Studio today, we're going to start by focusing on open source and how open source is approached by Microsoft right now. There's a lot of different layers to the open source ecosystem, and so being able to understand those and how it impacts your contributions is really helpful. There's a lot of different ways to contribute to Azure Data Studio, and so we're going to try to give a real broad overview of all those different things today. So whether it is giving feedback and being able to really leverage the open nature of Azure Data Studio with the code on GitHub, or if it is testing out preview features in some of our other builds. And then last but not least, we will be digging into the different ways that you can be working with the code of Azure Data Studio, whether it is leveraging extensibility or contributing to the core. Open source at Microsoft is not a small thing. This is a big and very real commitment. I'm going to start by talking about open source as a general concept. So beyond Microsoft, what is important to understand about open source software, whether it's an open source component that's developed by Microsoft or by someone else. There are really three primary tiers to keep in mind when you're looking at open source software. The first is that the code is open, it's available, and so that makes it transparent and inherently editable. If you have a copy of the source, you can edit it. Now, that doesn't mean that you can do anything you want with the code. The code is still licensed. How the code is licensed can vary very widely by different projects, and so it's an important thing to keep in mind, whether it's a Creative Commons or a very permissive MIT license that allows you to do just about anything with the project. And then there are many projects that also have a more proprietary license that restricts what can happen with the code. The code is still available, the code is still transparent to you, but how you use it is licensed per project. The other thing that's important to understand about open source software is just because the code is available doesn't mean that it is necessarily maintained, reviewed, or well written. However, because the code of open source software is available, you're able to make that assessment fairly transparently, fairly readily. So you can see how often the code has been changed. You can, depending on the environment that the code is stored in, see the specific code reviews or just kind of what it looks like, as well as external people can provide reviews, whether it's right there on the code or throughout the internet on different review sites. So it's important to know that an open source software, you've got access to the code, you might not be able to do anything with it, but it's important to look for kind of those question marks of what is happening with this code right now. Now, this sounds complicated, but that's also the case for proprietary software where you don't necessarily know, is it really well maintained, is it well written, and you don't have access to that source code. So with open source software, you're able to take that kind of question mark into your own hands, into the hands of experts within the field to help make those judgments. So by and large, it leads to a lot more transparency. The other thing that can happen is that I mentioned that there are experts in the field that can kind of comment on the software itself, keeping in mind that open source software helps us develop more experts, because the more you're reading other people's code, the better you're able to get at writing your own code. Now, when the code is available, it's oftentimes available on a source control system, GitHub, GitLab. That is not to say that it has to be on one of those systems. Open source software could be open in that it's zipped up and available on an FTP site, and frankly that's how open source software started, was through mailing lists and kind of code repositories like that, not the fully featured ecosystems we have today. The impact of open source software, the long-standing changes that it is influenced in the industry is phenomenal. We've seen new technologies come out of open source that go well beyond geographic or corporate boundaries. Different companies come together and collaborate for the sake of technology. Using those open source projects is almost like a demilitarized zone, a DMZ for progress. So we as an industry can get better faster because we're worried less about this is my project and this is someone else's project, but rather that this is a community project that we want to move forward together. The other impact I alluded to a moment ago is that we're getting better development practices. There are more options within technology because we can either have multiple operating systems that are rising and having active development. There are multiple cloud platforms. There are multiple JavaScript frameworks. There are more tools for us as developers because of open source projects. There's better visibility for where people can contribute, and that leads to more contributions and then more options. So it's good for us to have more options because it then can lead us to developing better practices. I mentioned that the open source advancements are coming because we're moving beyond corporate boundaries. And what I mean by that is that there are so many businesses that are involved in open source, these open source stewards. These can be businesses and these can be communities, kind of self-organized groups of users and open source developers. On the business front, you would potentially be surprised at all of the companies that are actively involved in open source software. So there's some there. Obviously, I'm here representing Microsoft, sharing with you an open source project today. And then this is not just an investment of time, but there is investments of money. There is promotion of other open source solutions. So if you think about Microsoft Azure and all of the open source software that runs so well on it, the fact that Linux runs so well in Microsoft Azure, it's part of that open source commitment of Microsoft as a company. The communities that are kind of self-regulated groups of users and developers that are promoting open source by trying to cultivate it. Some of the more organized communities, an example that I personally love is Home Assistant, which is a home automation platform. It is nearly commercial with the forums and the documentation and all of these components around that product, but it is not a company. It is a group of users that have pulled together to do that. Then there are smaller projects that are less organized. It's kind of the classic open source software that you might have thought of maybe 10 years ago. An example that I have for you is Raspberry Pints, which is a tap list that you can run off of a Raspberry Pi for your homebrew beer. So there's a very wide range of how organized a community might be. Think of this analogous to a user group that you might be participating in. It might fall somewhere along the spectrum of the organization that it has, the different capabilities that it has. An open source community can have that same breadth. On the very top tier of communities around open source software are a number of foundations that not only cultivate open source projects, but they protect open source concepts. And there are just a small handful of all these open source foundations that Microsoft participates in the ecosystems of these foundations. So it's going to be a continuing effort for Microsoft the company and Microsoft's employees to continue to contribute to open source. For developers, it's not often a hard sell to contribute to open source. So I'm hoping that I've kind of sold you on a rosy picture, and I want to convince you to contribute to open source, whether it's Azure Data Studio or another application. And that is kind of for two prongs. The first is for you as a person. Contributing to open source takes you out of your everyday projects that may be narrowly defined or may not change as often, and give you an opportunity to practice new technical skills, do some additional professional networking. You might not get to know the people as fast, but having someone else reading your code can sometimes be a difficult experience. So it helps sharpen your interpersonal skills. And then it gets you beyond your place of work. So there are new technologies out there that this is an opportunity to work on them. When I was a manager, it was worth my time for the team to work on open source projects because there was no better way for them to learn new technical skills that we might end up leveraging. The other side to contributing to open source is there are a lot of open source projects that help people. There are projects that help move things forward, like medical technology, faster than some companies are able to. And there are some of these projects that help those companies come together and collaborate. So there are a number of different examples around open source that helps people. And so your contributions may be benefiting other people. They could be benefiting other companies that you have an investment in their mission statement. And so there are some really good reasons to be contributing to open source. I'm hoping that I've sold you on contributing to open source. And so I'm going to hand it over to Hannah, who's going to talk to us a bit about Azure Data Studio and some of the ways that you can get started contributing.
Thanks, Drew. I'm just going to start by providing a brief history of ADS, starting with the state of SQL Server tooling in 2016. So up until just a few years ago, from the very beginning, we were a closed source team developing tools supported exclusively on Windows. And don't get me wrong, SSMS is a great tool, and our team still works on it today. But the fact of the matter was that times were changing, and we needed to adapt to our users as more and more of them started using different operating systems. And then the world began shifting towards open source collaboration for all of those great reasons that Drew highlighted just a few minutes ago. So our team started to explore what it meant to be or build a more flexible SQL tooling experience available on any platform and transparent to our community via open source collaboration. And so that's how Azure Data Studio was created, first released as SQL Operations Studio in 2017, and then released under the name of Azure Data Studio in GA status during Ignite of 2018. It's a cross-platform tool available on GitHub, and it's also a downstream fork of Visual Studio Code, which you might be familiar with as another very popular open source tool. So you can kind of think of ADS as the next evolution of data management on every platform. So it can do things that you're familiar with in SQL Server Management Studio, like query editing, some dashboarding, and on top of that, a whole lot more. At the same time, it's built to be lightweight and extensible. And what that means is that depending on your data persona, you're only installing the functionalities that you're interested in using on the day-to-day. So for example, if you're a data developer, then you're probably not interested in using any of the heavy DBA related features that are available as extensions. And one of our guiding principles as part of being open source is that we're making the tool approachably extensible. So that means that we're making it as easy as possible for anyone to start making meaningful contributions if they're interested. So that brings me to the first major way that you can get started contributing to Azure Data Studio today, which is through GitHub issues. Whether you have a really exciting feature request idea or whether you have a bug that you want to report to our team. So I'm actually going to transition over to my browser now to walk through a little bit of what GitHub issues look like and how you can get started contributing. So here I have the Azure Data Studio repo open, and to get started contributing to through feedback, you can just go ahead and click on the Issues tab up here. And right away, you'll see all of the issues that we have open already. You can search through these issues, you can filter them in a couple of different ways, and then you can sort them as well. And one thing that might stand out to you is that we have these colorful labels attached to each issue. And these are labels that our engineering team is actually going and adding daily just to make sure that we're keeping all of our issues organized and not losing track of any of them. I'm going to start by pulling up an example of a really great issue in the past that was a highly requested feature that actually exists in ADS today. So I'm going to go ahead and sort by the most thumbs up reactions, and I'm going to click on the closed features. And the feature I'm going to open up is this Add SQL Server Agent section. So there are a couple of different reasons I really like to use this issue as an example. And the first is that the author of the issue just did a really great job providing a lot of detail in their description. So they've provided their version number of what was SQL Operations Studio at the time and what we now know as Azure Data Studio. And this is especially important when you're submitting bug reports because it helps our engineers understand what your environment looks like, and it helps them to reproduce the bug that you're experiencing as quickly as possible. Then they've gone ahead and provided a quick description of the feature request and even gone so far as to mock up an example of how this feature might look in Azure Data Studio. This really helps our team to understand the scope of what you're requesting. And then the other thing that I really like about this issue is that there's been a lot of community participation. So you can see there have been plenty of reactions to the issue, which again indicates to our team that this is a feature that the community really wants us to make a higher priority. And then the last thing is that there are these great comments on this thread left by both members of the community and members of our engineering team. So on the community side, we have people jumping on and letting us know their specific use cases and scenarios. And from our team's perspective, we have both engineers and PMs jumping in on the thread, letting us know, or letting the community know what the status is of this feature, whether it's on a roadmap, whether there are blockers, or just scrolling down a little bit more, asking for further feedback on some early mock-ups of what SQL Agent might look like in ADS. Now, if you're noticing a bug or you have an idea for a new feature that you don't see an open issue for already, you can also go ahead and create your own new issue. So the way that you would do this directly in GitHub is that we have this green button, New Issue, up on the top right. In our repo, we'll ask you if you're wanting to submit a bug report or a feature request. And so for this case, I'm just going to click on Bug Report. And then what you'll see is some pre-populated text where you can fill in your version information just like that previous issue had demonstrated. And then most importantly, I think for a bug is listing out the steps to reproduce it. And that way, again, it just really helps our engineers get out a fix as fast as they can. Once you're done filling in details for your bug, you can click Preview to see how it will look. and then you can go ahead and click submit when you're ready. Now, I want to walk through a couple of different ways that you could really transform a bare bones issue into one that's going to catch our eye. So the first is by providing that block of version information. And I'm just going to show you exactly where you can find that in ADS. So if I open up Azure Data Studio, I'm on a Mac, so the way that I'm going to find this information is by going to the Azure Data Studio menu and click About Azure Data Studio. Now on Windows, this would actually just be located in Help, and there will be an About. So if I click on that, I can see all of this amazing information that I can just go ahead, copy, and then just paste it directly into my issue. And that's kind of how that would appear. And then if I'm experiencing a bug, then what it can be really helpful is if you actually open up the console of the app and see if there are any errors being printed there. So the way that I would open that up is by going to the Help menu, clicking Developer Tools, and here I have the console, and I could see if any related error messages are being printed. So again, that would be super helpful to copy into a bug report and help us to figure out exactly what's going on. And then the last thing I want to mention is that GIFs and screenshots are also a huge help in understanding what you're experiencing. So a couple of tools that we really like for recording GIFs. On Windows, Screen to GIF is what we tend to use. It's very lightweight. You can just very easily record a portion of your screen or your full screen and it'll save it as a GIF. On Mac, I think Giphy is a very popular tool, Giphy. Or a hackier way to do it is just to record a video of your screen and convert that to a GIF. As an example of pasting a GIF into this bug, I have this cute GIF of a puppy with a tennis ball. I'm just gonna quickly and easily drag that directly into the body of the issue. And if I click preview, then I have this amazing GIF of how to reproduce a puppy chewing on a tennis ball. And the last thing that I want to mention related to GitHub issues is that we also have a built-in feedback form in Azure Data Studio that can help you to pre-populate some of this information and submit an issue on GitHub. So I'm scrolling back over to my ADS window and I'm going to minimize it a little bit so you can see where I'm clicking. And the way to access this form is in this little icon in the bottom right corner of the window. And it'll first prompt you if you want to tweet us your feedback, since our team is extremely active in the Twitter community as well. But if you're wanting to directly submit your issue on GitHub, then you can click on one of these links here. I am clicking on Submit a Bug, and it'll open up our issue reporter. So this is where you can kind of fill in a couple more details, like what type of issue you want to submit, where you're experiencing the issue, and you can type in your title. I'm just going to put in a placeholder title for the sake of this demo. And then the body of your issue. So since this is a bug, we have steps to reproduce here. And then one of the benefits of using this built-in feedback form in ADS is that we've pre-populated all of this system information as well as all of your installed extensions, so that if you decide to include this information and we click preview on GitHub, it's all there in your issue already. And so all you have to do is, if you want, you can copy in your cute GIF or better yet, a useful GIF. And then whenever you're ready, you can go ahead and submit your new issue. And with that, I'm going to hop back on over to the PowerPoint. So we talked about voting and commenting on current issues, as well as how to create a really great new issue. One last thing related to these GitHub issues is that if there's one that you're particularly interested in staying informed on, then you can actually hit subscribe so you'll receive notifications that anytime that there's an update. And don't be afraid if it's been a while to jump back on the thread and see what's going on, see if any progress has been made, and we always try to respond as much as we can. Another great way to start contributing is by testing out features that we've released in preview status. So what does that mean exactly? Well, before a feature can be officially released as GA or generally available, it has to meet a set of criteria like accessibility, localization, stability and perf, and while these are incredibly important requirements to us, they can also be pretty time consuming. So, in keeping with our priority towards shipping incremental improvements early, quickly, and often, we'll typically release features first in a more limited version in preview status. And during this time, it's really crucial that we're receiving feedback from people like you because it helps us to prioritize which features that we invest in planning our roadmaps. And it also helps to define the direction that we take those features in moving towards GA. So if you want to go one step further, you can actually install what's called the Insider's build of ADS. And this gives you extremely early access to features. We are shipping Insiders on a daily basis, and so you're really experiencing the commits that our developers are submitting every single day. And this is kind of a double-edged sword because what that means is that there will be times Insiders is buggy or less stable, but you also do sometimes get access to features that don't get released in the stable build until sometimes a month out, sometimes longer. So this is another great way for you to be contributing to the community, and you can also provide feedback on your Insiders features on our GitHub as well. And the last section I want to talk about just really quickly is contributing to our documentation. So if I go ahead and scroll back over to my browser, I'm going to open up the Azure Data Studio download page. So I'm going to aka.ms/get Azure Data Studio. You can also easily open up the documentation just by searching Azure Data Studio docs. So I've just arrived at the Download Azure Data Studio page, and you can kind of browse through the entire table of contents of our documentation here. So we've got an overview of what the app is, we have quick starts, tutorials, some in-depth concepts, etc. And the cool thing about Microsoft Docs in general is that it is also open source and on GitHub. So it is just as open for you to contribute to as our application itself. And so you might be interested in diving as deep as writing a full article yourself, or you could even contribute in as simple a way as pointing out where we have typos or out-of-date text or screenshots. All of that collaboration is equally welcome. And so the way that you would get started to contribute to our documentation is at the bottom of this article, Download and Install, there is a section called Contribute to SQL Documentation. And here we have a link to a tutorial on how to contribute to SQL Server documentation. So this is where you would go ahead and get started learning how to edit our documentation. And with that, I am going to hand it back to Drew to start talking about how you can begin building extensions in ADS.
Let's talk about building extensions for Azure Data Studio. When thinking about building extensions for Azure Data Studio, it's helpful to break down your approach into two categories. The first is the design elements, and then the second is the contribution points. The design elements is going to be the user's point of view of your extension. How is the user interacting with the extension? So when we're looking at Azure Data Studio and comparing it with VS Code that it's a fork of, if you're familiar with the ways that extensions can interact with VS Code, Azure Data Studio is adding another layer of wizard type UIs and more button type interfaces to VS Code. We'll talk more about some of those design elements in a minute, but before we do that, we also want to think about what is the extension doing under the hood. Where is the extension connecting into Azure Data Studio's functionality in a way that, is it running commands? Is it going to run queries on a server? So the kind of building blocks behind the scenes. So if you think about the logical structure of that, that's going to be your contribution points. Some examples of these contribution points: I mentioned commands. You can add configuration settings to Azure Data Studio. You can adjust the menus within Object Explorer. You can add key bindings, so those keyboard shortcuts. You can add color themes. You can contribute groups of snippets, so those are those templated code snippets. The dashboards view, so when you right click a server or a database and hit manage, that's a dashboard view that you can extensively customize. And then within those dashboards there are containers that you can build out further. These are defined in that extensions manifest, the package.json file. So right from that start, you're able to kind of define this is how things are going to work. A command contribution point is kind of an open door to a lot of functionality, because you can trigger a command from a number of places, and that's where you think about those design elements from the UI. And then behind the scenes, that command can do just about anything you can do with code. When I say with code, you're likely going to be developing this extension in TypeScript or JavaScript, but you can connect into other frameworks from there. We're going to take a look at the design elements. So we've got the contribution points, and then we've got the design elements. So how is the user interacting with the extension? You may be just fine with the VS Code original UI elements, whether it's the command palette that pops up when you hit Control-Shift-P, whether it's the sidebar view or the status bar items down at the bottom, and then kind of the open season item of a web view, which can render an iframe within the application. Azure Data Studio adds on the dialog view and the wizard view, so buttons, text boxes, drop downs, all of those items are components that you can add rather quickly from Azure Data Studio. So the command palette that you get to from Control-Shift-P, if you're familiar with Azure Data Studio, you've seen it a lot, but you can search for and quickly access through the keyboard many items here, but they're not necessarily as immediately visible to the user. You can also trigger an input box or a quick pick multi-select to be available from that command palette. The sidebar view, where you think of the connections pane being the search box, you can add additional views to that sidebar to really give rich functionality beyond a single area. The status bar down at the bottom is usually fairly simple because it's a rather small space, but you can add buttons and indicators down there to kind of keep ever-present information in front of your user. And then last but not least, the web view that I mentioned is an iframe that's rendering within the application. This can be HTML, JavaScript that renders here. The classic example is a cat GIF that's typing on a keyboard. So there's a number of design elements that you get that have compatibility with VS Code that are then applicable to Azure Data Studio. But the dialog view, like we see here, where you've got a text box and a drop down, all the form elements that you think of when you're wanting to fill out information, as well as buttons to confirm and run commands at the bottom. The subtle difference between a dialog and a wizard is that a wizard chains multiple dialogues together, so you get that multi-step experience. So if you have a more complex experience that you want to be able to guide the user through, for example here the import flat file wizard, the wizard view is a great thing for that because it really gives you structure around that guided dialogue. Starting to develop an extension can be a new thing for many people. We understand that many people in the data platform space aren't developers first, they're data professionals first, and then developers. We wanted to make it as easy as possible to get started with developing extensions, and so we have an extension generator that is a command line tool, but it gives you the framework for developing an extension from the code standpoint. The extension generator itself can give you kind of the blank slate TypeScript or JavaScript extension, but it can also give you really well thought out examples of the kind of the key contribution points of a dashboard component, a color theme, code snippets, or a key map. So if you're thinking to yourself that I've got some code snippets that I want to make sure are available to everyone on my development team, you could put those code snippets into an extension, and if you started from the extension generator, you would be able to very quickly add those code snippets in there. We're going to demo the extension generator here in a second, but before I do that, we had a very exciting advancement to the extension generator this last summer, and that added some really specific generator types for notebook extensions, Jupyter book extension, and then wizard and dialog extensions. So they're really specific examples that are built out fairly far to get you started right with, if I think that my user UI for an extension is going to have a dialog, starting with that example means that you start from having an example that already has a dialog in it. So let's take a look at the extension generator and what that looks like. We're going to start from VS Code. In VS Code, I'm going to use the terminal, and this could be VS Code on Windows, on Mac, on Linux. And from that terminal, I have already installed the extension generator, which we run through Yo Azure Data Studio. When I run this command, it's going to give me that prompt that we saw on the slides a moment ago, asking what kind of extension do we want to create. I would like my extension to have a dialog interface in it, so we're going to select that option. You have to use the arrows to scroll down to that new wizard or dialog, and then I will select the dialog example. It's going to ask me for a display name, so I'm going to say this is an example dialog extension, and it's going to be published by me. And then this is going to be testing the dialog interface description. I'm going to initialize a Git repository. It gives me an opportunity to make sure that I can track my changes and then roll back if anything does not go right. You can use either NPM or Yarn, and if you don't have a opinion one way or another, it defaults to NPM, and we'll stick with that. The extension generator has created the files that give us the initial structure of the extension, and now it's going to run npm install to grab those initial required dependencies. While it runs npm install, I want to talk quick about the files that we're going to see. I mentioned earlier the extension manifest or the package.json file. This file gives us the opportunity to define those contribution points and where our extension is reaching into Azure Data Studio and should be expected. The other code that we want to really pay attention to is within the source folder. There's going to be a couple of TypeScript files, and we're looking for one that may be called extension.typescript or main.typescript that contains that code entry point, and that's an activation function, and we'll go to that in a second. The other thing to note is that there will be a .vs Code folder that controls kind of how VS Code interacts with the project. There's some really cool stuff that we can do with VS Code to debug the extension while we do it. And so while we're developing it, we'll be able to leverage the VS Code folder contents. We won't have to change them, but we'll be able to leverage them to test that extension in a special instance of Azure Data Studio. So the npm install of the dependencies for the sample has finished, and our extension is now available in a new folder, example dialog extension. And if I open up code there, it's going to have that extension for me. So I am going to go ahead and cd to example dialog extension, and then open up code right in that folder. It's going to open up a new instance of VS Code for me, with a folder structure similar to the slide that we were just looking at. We have our extension manifest, that's this JSON file, and the contribution points. So when we talk about a contribution point, in this case it's a command, and the command is launch dialog. So in the command palette we would look for launch dialog to test this out. We want to be able to test this out. How would we do that? There is an extension for VS Code that is focused on being able to debug Azure Data Studio extensions. So since we're developing an Azure Data Studio extension, and I have this debug extension installed, if I go to run and start debugging, it's going to kick off that Azure Data Studio instance, and we'll be able to see that extension in action. So we get the extension development instance of Azure Data Studio opening now. This instance of Azure Data Studio is very similar to the general Azure Data Studio instances that you're working with on your machine. It's going to be based on those installations. However, it is host to that extension that you've developed. So if we open the command palette with Control-Shift-P and then search for launch dialog, it's already has that command and that extension installed for us. So if I select that command, it's going to kick right into this sample dialog, whether it is the different tabs in the dialog or a drop-down element. We've got radio buttons. All of those pieces are part of the extension that came from the extension generator. So there's some functionality for us to take a look at. So Azure, VS Code is still debugging the extension. I left Azure Data Studio open for a moment so we can take a look at the code. Within the source folder, there is a main.typescript file. There's quite a bit of documentation within the code that comes with the extension generator, but this activate function is called when the extension itself is loaded into Azure Data Studio by either the command being called or when Azure Data Studio is started, if you've designated that as that point. And then here is the command, and then these are the things that happen with it, including creating that dialog with the two tabs in it. So for example, we can see that the tab is based on the Azure Data Studio API for Windows and the dialog tab, the tab for the dialog. So you're seeing some of the components that are coming out of the Azure Data Studio API. Now, there's some documentation to learn more about the APIs. Another way to get information on the Azure Data Studio APIs is right within VS Code. We can right click on an AZ data reference and go to type definition. And when we go to definition for AZ data, it's going to give us the full API file. It is extensive. There is quite a bit here in the file. You can also access this file on the GitHub repository. So there's a couple different ways to take a look at it. And it details out all the different, not just contribution points, but all the additional things that Azure Data Studio can help you do. So whether it is working as a connection provider or a backup and restore provider, there are different fields on a connection that you can access. There's a whole host of things that you can do through this API. However, you are not limited to just the Azure Data Studio APIs, just the VS Code APIs. You can add additional node modules to your Azure Data Studio extension. So let's say I wanted to be able to access some information about the operating system that the extension was running on. Let's go ahead and add that functionality here real briefly. I'm going to close out our extension development instance of Azure Data Studio. I know of an NPM module that would give us that capability, and that is the OS NPM module. So I'm going to say npm install the OS module. That's going to bring that dependency into my project. And while it does that, I'm going to import it into the file. So now I have import star as OS from OS. We've brought that module into our extension. All I'm going to do is leverage a VS Code API real quick to display some information from the operating system. So when the dialog gets created, before it opens, I'm going to say VS Code window.show information message, and the content of that message should come from the OS module. We will do platform. So we will get the platform that the extension is running off of right in that information message right before the dialog opens. And we have access to this information because we've added an additional node module to our extension. So I have saved this file. I haven't changed the command or the user, the way that the user invokes this at all. So I am going to go ahead and start debugging now, and let's see if this information message pops up when I launch the dialog. So if I launch dialog, we should see the dialog, and we should see an information message pop up, and it says that I am on a Win32 device, and we have our dialog there. So you're able to add additional functionality to extensions outside of the APIs, but that is not to say that they are not incredibly rich. So we just kind of took a quick tour through what developing extensions for Azure Data Studio entails from a kind of logistical standpoint. When it comes to what it takes to get started with developing extensions, it is a really nice way to get started is through the Azure Data Studio repo, but then in the wiki. there is some documentation on getting started with extensibility. However, you can also go to the Microsoft Docs site and look at the extensibility development documentation there. So there's kind of those two primary locations that have helpful information. Once you have the extension generator, you're ready to roll. You can start diving in and creating your next extension. Beyond developing extensions, the full code of Azure Data Studio is open for contributions. If there is an area of interest that you would like to start diving in with, the repository itself accepts pull requests, and we are more than happy to engage with you on those additions. So if you're thinking about getting started with contributing code to the core of Azure Data Studio, if you, in the repository, you may find that there are some issues that people have submitted that we've marked as either good first issue or help wanted. And that is our way of trying to make things more accessible for folks to hop in and kind of join in with the team in ways where we are ready to talk to you about it and help out as you work through that. For getting started with contributing, it can have a steeper learning curve than developing extensions. So I oftentimes recommend that people take a look at the extensibility framework first to start gaining some understanding of the overall framework for Azure Data Studio. However, you are more than welcome to dive right in. And within the wiki, there is also a guide on contributing to Azure Data Studio and getting started with that. So under contributing, there is a developer getting started and a how to contribute. Under how to contribute, it gives you an idea of what the workflow is for development. And then developer getting started is extremely helpful because it walks you through the prerequisites for developing Azure Data Studio. The other recent change to the Azure Data Studio development environment is that there is a dev container or a code space that is part of the repository that can be used for development if you don't want to set up your local development machine. So you have that choice as well. I'm going to take a quick look here at what development looks like locally for Azure Data Studio and how you can build your own Azure Data Studio right from your machine. In this VS Code window here, I have forked Azure Data Studio, making a copy of it within my account on GitHub, and then I've cloned that to my machine. So I am not pushing code right into that main Azure Data Studio repository. I'm not going to break anything. I have my own development instance. With Azure Data Studio uses Yarn to manage its dependencies. So if I want to take this code and build it into Azure Data Studio on my machine, I would do so by opening up the terminal and then running Yarn to install these dependencies. I didn't just know this. I read the developer getting started guide that I mentioned on GitHub that pointed me on this direction. The next thing that I'm going to do once Yarn completes in a bit is I'm going to use one of the scripts in the script folder for SQL to build Azure Data Studio so that it can run on my machine. Depending on your operating system, you may use the batch file or the shell file. I'm on a Windows machine right now, so once Yarn has completed, I will be running the SQL.bat file to build and then open Azure Data Studio on my machine. When it builds and when it opens, it's going to be the code that is in this folder. So if I have started to make changes, if I have been developing a new feature, if I've been fixing bugs, I would be able to see those right here on my machine. Before you get started developing features and looking at different bugs, I always recommend that people go ahead and create a new create a new branch for Azure Data Studio right on their machine so that you're able to track those different changes real nicely and then always return back to main when you want that working build. So Yarn has finished running and we're ready to go ahead and run that build script. So if I run scripts SQL.batch, it's going to go ahead and build Azure Data Studio based on the code here on my machine, and I'm able to test it and see the changes that I've made right on my computer. We'll know the Azure Data Studio instance on our machine because it's going to say Azure Data Studio Dev up at the top. So we talked about the Azure Data Studio Insiders branch earlier. You're likely already familiar with the Azure Data Studio regular stable branch, but this is kind of that third secret instance of Azure Data Studio that you can be running, and that is literally Azure Data Studio that you have built yourself from code on your computer. Azure Data Studio being open source, the code is open and transparent to you, and you can modify and build the code on your machine. It is almost done building, and there it is. This is Azure Data Studio, the dev version that we have built on our machine. It has all the capabilities of the code that I have cloned to my computer. As I start to make changes, I will see them propagate here. You have this same ability that I do because Azure Data Studio is open source. You can grab the code right off of GitHub and you can start playing away. So if you see an issue that you want to tackle, if there's a feature that you feel strongly about, we would love to work with you on the pull request and talk with you about the implementation and the issues. So do open that conversation with us if you're unsure about getting started, but we would love to work with anyone on their interest in developing Azure Data Studio. Well, that's all that we have time for today. We hope that we've piqued your interest in open source, shown you all the opportunities that are available to contribute to Azure Data Studio, and then even given you some tips in getting started as an Azure Data Studio contributor. We talked about how the overall open development of Azure Data Studio is bringing increased transparency to our users. So whether it's seeing things that are actively in develop or that open discussion on GitHub, both on feature requests as well as we're hunting down bugs, is absolutely welcome. So as you think of your great ideas and even as you put together kind of mock-ups and screenshots as Hannah showed us, that's great. Documentation contributions are extremely helpful, and that's at any scale. So if there's something that's out of date and you just want to point it out, that's helpful. But if you have an article that you want to write, that is also helpful. We talked quite a bit about extension development and how that is made easier through the extension generator, as well as while extension development is a really cool way to add specific functionality to Azure Data Studio, it's also a nice gateway if you're interested in also potentially contributing code to the core of Azure Data Studio. Anyone can grab the code for Azure Data Studio right off the repository on GitHub and try it out in your own environment with your own changes and build it there. If you implement a feature or fix a bug and want to submit a pull request or even have questions along the way, we would love to talk to you about that. So there are a lot of opportunities to become part of the Azure Data Studio community through contributing to it, and we're hoping that by having this open source community and application where we're able to kind of work together for the betterment of the data platform, we're going to get further together. Again, I'm Drew Skwiers Koballa. My co-presenter is Hannah. Our contact information is here. If you have any further questions that we're not able to get to here in just a moment, please feel free to reach out to us. Thanks so much for joining us today.